The morning sunlight crept through the lace curtains, tracing delicate patterns across the kitchen walls. Dust particles floated like tiny stars, spinning lazily in the golden glow. The house was quiet, not an empty kind of quiet, but the kind that came from years of routine. Margaret Turner stood at the sink, her hands resting on the edge, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The faint aroma of jasmine filled the air, her favorite scent since she was young. She stared through the window at the small garden beyond, where roses leaned gently toward the light. Every morning looked the same in Margaret's world, soft, slow, and measured. She liked it that way, or at least that's what she told herself. The truth was, silence had become both her comfort and her companion. It filled the spaces where laughter used to live, where her late husband, Charles, once read the newspaper aloud just to make her smile. Now, years later, she found herself speaking to the air sometimes, as though he were still there, still humming his favorite tune as he fixed the old radio or polished his wooden tools. "Charles," she whispered softly, as if the morning might carry her voice somewhere beyond the light. "You'd tell me to stop worrying so much?" Her words dissolved into the quiet hum of the refrigerator. She took another sip of tea, its warmth grounding her. On the kitchen table sat a small stack of mail bills, a few leaflets, and one neatly folded letter from her daughter Emily. The letter had been written by hand, which was rare these days. Margaret smiled at that. She unfolded it gently. Asterisk, Mom. Ethan's been talking about visiting you this weekend. He says he misses your pies and your stories. I hope you're doing okay. Asterisk. Margaret's smile deepened. Ethan, her grandson, now 17, had always been her joy. He had the same thoughtful eyes as Charles and the same quiet kindness that never demanded attention but was always felt. Her heart lifted a little at the thought of him. Coming over, she began to tidy the kitchen, humming under her breath as she moved from one corner to another. But beneath the light rhythm of her day, there was something unspoken, a feeling she rarely allowed herself to explore. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was something softer, a quiet ache for something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the longing to feel seen again, to have someone look at her and understand. The history written in her smile lines and silver hair. She had been loved deeply once. And yet sometimes she wondered what it would feel like to be loved now, not for the years she had lived, but for the person she still was inside. That thought always made her feel a little guilty, like she was betraying Charles's memory. But love, she had learned, doesn't erase the longing for connection. It just changes its shape, becoming a gentle wish instead of a need. The sound of a car engine outside pulled her from her thoughts. Margaret turned toward the window, her pulse quickening. It was too early for Ethan, but the sight of any visitor always stirred something inside her. A flutter of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The car rolled past. A stranger waved as he passed by, and she waved back, smiling at her own eagerness. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Goodness, Margaret. You'd think you were 16 again? The laughter faded, leaving her in the soft stillness once more. She turned to the old wooden shelf where photographs lined the wall, her life captured in frozen smiles. Her wedding photo, her daughter as a child, Ethan as a toddler with jam on his cheeks. Each picture was a memory, but together they were something more, proof of a life fully lived. Yet somehow still unfinished. Margaret reached out and touched the frame holding Charles's picture. His smile still had the power to fill the room, even from across time. I'm doing fine, she whispered, but it's quiet without you. Outside, a breeze stirred the chimes by the porch. Their soft tinkling filled the air, almost like an answer. Margaret stood there for a long while, letting the moment settle over her. Then, with a small sigh, she turned back to her table and pulled out a recipe card, Grandma's apple pie. She smiled. Let's see if I still remember how to make you proud, Charles, as she gathered ingredients. The radio played a gentle tune from decades past, one that carried her straight back to the evenings when she and Charles would dance barefoot in the kitchen. She paused, one hand resting on the counter, eyes closed, swaying just a little. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was something deeper, a longing that lived quietly in her heart. waiting for something new to awaken it, and somewhere inside that longing, she felt a whisper of possibility, something telling her that not all stories of love end where we think they do. As the timer clicked on the oven, the camera of life seemed to pull back, revealing a woman who had loved, lost, and learned, but perhaps hadn't finished living her story just yet, because sometimes love doesn't come to those who seek it. It comes to those who least expect it, in small moments, in laughter, or even in the footsteps of someone walking up the porch steps, bringing with them a new chapter. Margaret didn't know it yet, but that quiet longing in her heart was about to be stirred again. In the most unexpected way, the afternoon lights softened as the day stretched toward evening. The scent of apples and cinnamon filled the kitchen, wrapping the house in a tender calm. Margaret wiped her hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, her eyes wandering to the window once again. Outside, the garden swayed gently in the autumn breeze. A few golden leaves drifted across the yard, dancing their slow descent to the earth. Watching them, she felt that familiar tug inside, the way memories could rise from the smallest moments, as if carried by the wind itself. She took her cup of tea and walked into the living room. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her feet, a sound that had become part of the home's heartbeat. On the mantel sat a small box she hadn't touched in months, the one with Charles's letters. But as she reached for it, something else caught her eye. A different photograph. One she had almost forgotten. It was taken many years before she met Charles, long before the wrinkles, the wisdom, and the quiet evenings. In it, she was barely 20, standing beneath a maple tree beside a young man named Thomas. Her heart tightened as the memory unfolded. Thomas Gray. He had been her friend from college, gentle, witty, the kind of person who always noticed the small things. He used to tease her about her habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. Back then, the world had felt wide and open, full of promise and laughter. She remembered the library where they met, that soft scent of old paper and rain on windows. They had been studying for exams, seated across from each other, both too shy to start a conversation. Until one afternoon, he slid a note across the table. Asterisk, if I ask you about the weather, will you smile at me instead of frowning at your book? Asterisk, she had laughed quietly, a laugh she didn't even realize she'd been holding back. That was how it started, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with shared smiles in quiet corners. They walked home together most evenings after that, the conversations flowing easily about books, dreams, and the small hopes that make young hearts beat faster. Margaret had never told him then, but those walks were the best part of her days. Sometimes he would stop near the bridge by the river, pointing at the reflection of the sunset on the water. "It looks like gold, doesn't it?" he'd say. She'd nod, too shy to meet his eyes. "It feels like something worth remembering." And somehow, she had remembered every shade of that light, every word spoken beneath it. But as all young stories go, life shifted. Thomas had been offered a position out of state, a chance to follow his dreams. She was proud of him, of course, but a quiet ache settled beneath her pride. They had promised to write to each other, and for a while they did. Letters full of hope and everyday life. His new adventures, her work at the local library, the weather, the roses she was trying to grow. Then one summer the letters slowed, and eventually they stopped. Not out of cruelty, but simply because time has a way of closing doors softly. She never saw him again. A few years later, she met Charles at a community dance, and for the first time, she learned what it meant to be truly seen, not just admired. Charles had steadied her life, built a world around her that was safe, constant, and full of laughter. Their love was a quiet kind, the kind that stayed through every storm. But even in that steady love, a small echo of her past remained. Not regret, not longing, but something gentler. A soft what if tucked in the corners of her heart. Now, decades later, as she held that old photograph in her hand, Margaret smiled wistfully. Thomas's face had faded with time, but the warmth of his memory hadn't. He represented something she rarely thought about anymore: youth, beginnings, and the tenderness of first emotions. She placed the photo back carefully, tracing the edge of the frame. "Funny," she murmured. "You never forget the people who made you feel alive for the first time." The clock on the wall chimed 6 times, pulling her gently back to the present. The pie was cooling on the counter. The house bathed in the amber glow of sunset. Margaret sat down, her tea now lukewarm, her mind somewhere between then and now. She thought about Ethan, how young he still was, how much life was waiting for him. And suddenly she understood his question from the letter even more deeply. Love was something that never really left a person. It only changed its shape through the years. Margaret reached for a pen and a notepad. On it, she began to write a short message for Ethan, something she wanted him to read when he came over. Asterisk. Love isn't only something you find when you're young. It's something you keep learning all your life, in memories, in laughter, and in kindness. Asterisk. She smiled softly as she set the note aside. Outside, the sky deepened to rose and violet, and for a brief moment she could almost hear the faint echo of a young man's laughter carried on the wind, warm, familiar, and kind. The past, she realized, never truly disappears. It simply finds new ways to whisper to the heart. And as the last bit of sunlight faded from her garden, Margaret closed her eyes and whispered to the evening air, "Thank you, Thomas, for reminding me how love begins." The next morning arrived, wrapped in soft gray clouds. The air carried that fresh scent of rain that always reminded Margaret of spring, even though autumn had already begun to paint her world in shades of gold and rust. She stood by the window, stirring her tea slowly, lost in thought. Ethan was coming that afternoon, and she had prepared everything: the pie, the tablecloth, even the old photo albums she thought he might enjoy. Yet, beneath her calm smile, there was a ripple of restlessness she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the memory of the photograph she had held last night, the face of someone she hadn't seen in half a lifetime. Thomas Gray. She hadn't thought about him in years. And yet somehow, thinking of him had left her heart feeling lighter, as if some long-closed window had opened quietly in her soul. The doorbell rang. Margaret set her cup down and hurried toward the door, her heart lifting. Ethan had arrived early, but when she opened it, she froze. It wasn't Ethan. A tall man stood on her porch, holding a small envelope. His hair was silver now, his eyes softened by time, but still unmistakably familiar. For a heartbeat, the years between them disappeared. "Thomas," she breathed. He smiled, a little shy, a little unsure. "Hello, Margaret. It's been a while." Her hand trembled slightly against the doorframe. I can't believe this. What on earth are you doing here?" "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said, his voice low and kind. "I was passing through town. I saw your name on the mailbox. I almost didn't knock, but I'm glad you did." She interrupted softly. The air between them felt fragile, almost sacred. Decades of silence seemed to rest gently on their shoulders, yet not a hint of awkwardness, only the warmth of two souls recognizing something timeless. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, stepping aside. He nodded, and as he entered, the faint scent of rain followed him. Margaret led him to the living room, where the kettle still hummed faintly on the stove. "It's strange," he said with a quiet laugh, looking around. "This place feels exactly like I imagined it would. Peaceful, warm, and somehow—" Margaret smiled, feeling the years slip away. "You always had a way with words, Thomas. Some things never change." They sat across from each other, 2 cups of tea steaming between them. For a long time they didn't speak, and yet so much was said in that silence. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I stopped writing. I didn't mean to. Life got complicated." Margaret shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything. We were young. Life has its own plans." He looked at her, his gaze tender but respectful. "Still, I always wondered how you were. I never forgot our walks by the river, or how you'd talk about the world like it was full of magic." Her smile softened. "It was easier to believe in magic when we were young." "Maybe," he said. But I think some of it stays with us, even if we stop noticing. Margaret looked out the window where the first drops of rain began to fall. For a moment she felt that same golden reflection from long ago, the kind that turned an ordinary moment into something that lasted. You know, she said after a pause, I almost didn't recognize you. But then you smiled, and suddenly it was yesterday again. Thomas chuckled quietly. You haven't changed as much as you think, Margaret. She blushed slightly, not out of vanity, but from the unexpected kindness of the moment. You always did have a gentle way of saying things. A comfortable silence filled the room. The rain grew heavier, tapping softly on the windows. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope he'd been holding. I actually came to give you this, he said. I found it in an old box of letters I kept from those days. It's one you wrote, but it was never sent. I think it got tucked behind the others somehow. Margaret hesitated before taking it. The paper was yellowed, her handwriting young and steady. She read the first line quietly, her eyes misting. Asterisk Thomas. If I never get to tell you this in person, I hope you know how much your kindness changed the way I see the world. Asterisk, she pressed the letter gently against her chest. I remember writing this, I just never knew it didn't reach you. I guess it did, he said softly. Just a few years late. They both laughed then, softly. Gratefully, the sound of two people acknowledging time's strange, forgiving rhythm before they could say more. A car pulled into the driveway. Ethan. Margaret looked toward the window. That must be my grandson. Thomas smiled. You're a grandmother now? Somehow that feels right, she smiled back. You'll meet him if you're not in a hurry to leave. Not at all, he said. I've waited this long. What's another cup of tea? As Ethan stepped through the door moments later, his eyes widened. Grandma, who's this? Margaret glanced at Thomas, her expression full of warmth. An old friend, sweetheart. One I thought I'd never see again. Ethan grinned, offering his hand. Then it must be a special day. And indeed, it was Dot. As the three of them sat together, the rain continued to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. And in that gentle sound, Margaret felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. Because sometimes, life brings people back not to change the past, but to remind you that love in all its quiet forms never really leaves. The rain eased into a soft drizzle by the time the pie was served. The three of them, Margaret, Thomas, and Ethan, sat around the kitchen table, their laughter mingling with the sound of raindrops against the window. It felt strange, almost dreamlike to see Thomas sitting there again after so many years. His silver hair caught the light like snow, and when he smiled, she could still glimpse the young man who once handed her a note in a quiet library. Ethan had taken to him instantly, asking about his travels and stories from the past. Thomas had a way of answering that made even the simplest tale sound like a memory worth keeping. Margaret mostly listened, her heart full but calm, like watching a fire glow on a cold night. After dessert, Ethan excused himself to take a phone call. Leaving the two of them alone in the warmth of the kitchen, for a long while, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was something deeper, full of unsaid words, shared history, and gentle gratitude. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. I still can't believe you're here, Thomas. After all these years. Why now? Thomas looked down at his teacup, then met her eyes with a small, wistful smile. I lost my wife 2 years ago. Cancer. It's been quiet since then. I thought I was managing, but lately I've felt this pull to revisit the places that once meant something to me. Margaret's eyes softened. I'm so sorry. He nodded. Thank you. She was wonderful. I'm not looking for anything more than peace now. Just trying to remember who I used to be. Margaret felt something stir inside her: empathy, understanding, and a quiet ache that wasn't sorrow, but connection. I understand, she said gently. It's strange, isn't it? How life moves on, yet the heart still remembers where it started. He gave a faint laugh. I think that's why I came. Not to find what was lost, but to thank the moments that made me who I am. You were one of those moments, Margaret. Her breath caught. the words lingering in the air like the last note of a song. She smiled, not the kind born of excitement, but of deep peace. You don't know how much that means to me. He reached across the table, his hand stopping halfway, respectful and steady. I do, because I think we both know that what we had, even if it was brief, mattered. She nodded. It did. For a moment, the house felt as if it were listening to every wall, every shadow holding the memory of love in its quietest form. Ethan returned just then, cheerful as ever. Mom says to tell you both she'll be late picking me up. The rain slowed traffic. Margaret smiled, relieved for the gentle break in emotion. Then you'll have to help me pack some pie to take home. Thomas chuckled softly. And maybe one more cup of tea before I go. They spent another hour together, talking, laughing, remembering. The conversation drifted from past to present easily, like waves meeting the shore. Ethan listened with fascination, occasionally glancing between them with the curiosity only the young have, sensing that something beautiful was unfolding, even if he didn't yet understand it. When the time came for Thomas to leave, the rain had stopped completely. The world outside was washed clean, the air carrying that fresh, earthy scent that always follows a storm. At the doorway, he turned to her. I wasn't sure what I'd find when I knocked on your door today, he said softly. But I think I found exactly what I needed. A reminder that kindness lasts, and that some hearts stay gentle no matter how much time passes. Margaret's eyes glistened. You always had a poet's way of saying things, Thomas. He smiled faintly. Maybe, but this time I mean every word. She wanted to say something more, something about gratitude, about how his visit had stirred something alive in her again, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out and gently squeezed his hand. Thank you for finding me, she whispered. He squeezed back, his eyes kind. Take care of yourself, Margaret. And with that, he was gone, walking down the path as the evening light began to fade. Ethan stood beside her, watching him leave. He seemed really nice, Grandma. He is, she said softly. He's a good man from a good memory. They stood together in silence for a moment. Then Ethan glanced at her curiously. You know, Grandma, when I asked you about love last time, I didn't think you'd show me the answer. But I think I get it now. She smiled, turning to him. And what's that, dear? He grinned. That love isn't just about holding on. It's about remembering kindly even when people drift apart. Margaret felt her heart swell. You're wiser than I was at your age. He laughed. I have a good teacher. As the sun broke through the clouds, its soft light filled the kitchen once more. Margaret returned to the table and sat quietly, her heart full not of longing, but of peace. She thought of Charles, of Thomas, of all the moments that had shaped her life. Love, she realized, wasn't a single story. It was many woven through time, carried forward in kindness, and passed down through the generations. She reached for her pen and opened the same notepad she'd written in the night before. Beneath her earlier words, she added one last line. Asterisk, love never ends. It simply learns new ways to stay. Asterisk. She placed the note on the table for Ethan to find later. Then looked out at the garden where the rain had left a silver sheen on every leaf. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't feel alone. She felt complete.